The day they buried Dean Mercer under the red dirt outside Red Mesa, the whole town agreed on one thing. He had died poor, chasing a machine that only worked when it rained. Naomi Mercer came home to claim a mortgaged house, a few worthless acres, a bent iron gear, and a map that led nowhere. Warren Kincaid set $800 on the table before she had even left the graveyard, calling it a generous price for a dead man's foolishness. That night, by lamplight, she noticed the red cross on the old canvas map lined up exactly with the place in the dry creek bed where something metal still answered when the wind moved the sand. Follow Naomi as she digs into the desert floor, brings a mocked invention back to life, and finds out what it takes to save a town that once laughed her father into his grave. The wind that afternoon carried red dust across a scattering of wooden grave markers, and only a handful of old ranchers stood close enough to Dean Mercer's open grave to hear the preacher finish his short prayer. Everyone else kept their distance, murmuring about Mad Mercer and the rain machine he had wasted his life building, the same joke the town had been telling for 3 years running. Naomi stood at the edge of the crowd in a black traveling coat, her spine straight, her jaw set, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her cry. 7 years earlier, she had stood in this same dirt and begged her father to sell the land, abandon the machine, and come live with her in Prescott, where a man his age belonged near a doctor and a decent well. Dean had only told her he could not leave yet, because the machine was not finished, and Naomi had answered that he loved a pile of scrap iron more than he loved his own daughter. Neither of them had taken those words back in all the years since, and now there was no taking them back at all. After the service, Grant Holloway read out what Dean had left behind, and the list did not take him long. There was a mortgaged house, a herd of cattle already sold off to cover debts, a freight wagon claimed by creditors, a blacksmith shop nearly stripped bare, no cash, no gold, no mining claim, and a tax bill of $780 still owed to the territory. What remained besides the debts was a few acres running along the dry bed called Mercy Wash, one bent iron gear nobody could explain, a small toolbox, and a canvas map covered in markings that meant nothing to anyone in the room. Warren Kincaid found Naomi before she could leave the cemetery, offering $800, just enough to clear the tax debt and put a little in her pocket besides. He called the land sand cattle bones, rattlesnakes, and a fitting grave for a crazy man's invention, and he advised her, almost gently, to take the money and go back to whatever life she had built for herself away from Red Mesa. For one long moment standing in that wind, Naomi nearly said yes. That night, alone in the empty house, she unfolded the map by lamplight, intending to burn it before she left town for good. Something stopped her hand an inch from the flame, a small collection of details that refused to add up the way Warren wanted them to. He had known the exact size of the tax debt before anyone told him. He had come in person instead of sending a lawyer or a clerk. His offer landed almost precisely on the number owed to the county, no more, no less. And in the middle of his pitch, almost as an afterthought, he had asked about the bent gear, wanting to know exactly where she kept it. Naomi spread the canvas flat under the lamp and studied it properly for the first time, and there, unmistakable, 7 small notches cut into the rim of that same gear matched 7 circles drawn in a line down the length of Mercy Wash. Warren Kincaid had not ridden out to buy a few dry acres and a dead man's reputation. He had ridden out to buy whatever her father had buried beneath the sand. The map itself was drawn on a strip of old canvas, and it carried none of the things a treasure map was supposed to carry. There were no roads marked on it, no town names, no property lines, no claim numbers, nothing that pointed toward gold or silver. What it held instead was 7 circles arranged along a dry wash, 1 red cross, 3 curving lines running down from a ridge called Black Ridge, and a scattering of symbols that looked more like wheels and levers than landmarks. Across the bottom, in her father's careful hand, ran a single sentence that read, "When the creek roars, the wheel must already be waiting." Naomi understood almost immediately that this was not a map of a place so much as a map of a machine, and she carried it the next morning to Cole Avery, a blacksmith who had once forged parts for her father without ever seeing the whole design. Cole turned the bent gear over in his hands and guessed at first that Dean had simply used bad iron. But a light tap with his hammer told a different story, because the metal gave in a way that ordinary cast iron never would. He realized Dean had made it soft on purpose, choosing a gear built to bend rather than a shaft built to break. Together they rode out to Mercy Wash, and beneath the drifting sand they found 3 iron stakes worn nearly smooth, a rotted length of wooden trough, 2 curved walls of stacked stone shaped like a bow, dried oil staining 1 flat rock, and a ring of iron poking just above the surface. When Naomi stepped onto the dry creek bed, she heard something hollow answer beneath her boots. That same night, someone sat on horseback atop a low rise and watched the Mercer house for a long while without approaching. By morning, Warren had raised his offer to $1,500, framing it as concern rather than greed. He told her plainly that she did not understand machinery the way her father had, that a woman alone could not hold her ground against a desert that had already broken stronger men, and that digging up her father's failed invention would only earn her the same laughter he had earned. Better, he said, to let it stay buried where it could finally rest. Naomi refused him outright, and afterward Cole drove an iron rod down into the creek bed, striking metal at a depth of nearly a yard. The sound that traveled up through the rod ran on far longer than any small model could explain, and both of them understood in that instant that whatever lay beneath the wash was larger by far than the failed contraption the town remembered from the fair. Dean Mercer had not buried a toolbox or a strongbox out there in the desert. He had buried an entire machine. Naomi and Cole dug carefully with shovels rather than blasting powder, afraid of damaging whatever lay below. And after several hours of steady work, they uncovered a thick wooden lid coated in hardened pine resin. Beneath it sat a small stone chamber, and inside that chamber they found a heavy wagon axle, 2 iron pistons, a flywheel, sections of drive chain, lengths of copper pipe, strips of cowhide gasket, a cast iron gear, an iron lever, and the initials DM stamped beside the year 1880. Cole recognized the arrangement at once as a drivetrain, a system built so that a turning water wheel could pull the axle and force the 2 pistons to pump in alternating strokes, lifting far more water than any hand pump could manage on its own. But something about the chamber troubled Naomi as she studied it more closely. One valve had clearly been removed. A section of chain had been deliberately cut. Fresh boot prints marked the damp sand near the entrance, and one iron pin did not match the careful forging style Dean had used on every other part of the machine. Nolan Price arrived while they were still examining the chamber and asked them to fill the hole back in before it cost Naomi everything her father's reputation had already cost him. Naomi asked how he knew the machine's real name, since she had never spoken it aloud in his presence, and Nolan fell silent in a way that told her more than any answer could have. Grant Holloway followed not long after, delivering an official notice that forbade any further digging in Mercy Wash, citing its official use as a floodway. Warren arrived with 2 hired men close behind, calling the buried machine a death trap waiting to happen. Cole pointed out, calmly and correctly, that the drivetrain used no steam, no boiler, and nothing capable of exploding the way Warren claimed, and in his hurry to argue the point, Warren glanced directly at the spot where the missing valve had once sat, before Naomi had said a single word about it. That night the half-filled hole was buried again by someone else's hands. The iron probing rod disappeared. The main length of chain vanished from where they had left it, and wagon tracks led away from the site toward Kincaid land. In her father's toolbox, Naomi found a brass valve he had kept separate from the rest, and along its housing, an arrow once marked the direction water should flow through it, an arrow that had since been carefully filed away. Someone had reversed that valve once before, turning her father's own invention against itself, forcing it to pump mud back through its own veins instead of water. Naomi sat with that brass valve for a long while before she set it back in the toolbox, turning it over in her hands, the way her father must have turned it over 100 times before her. She thought of all the nights he must have sat alone in this same house, listening to the town call him crazy, while he kept forging parts nobody believed would ever matter. She thought of the 7 years she had spent in Prescott, telling herself she had left a stubborn old fool behind, when in truth she had left a man quietly building something that could have saved every family for miles around. The shame she had carried out of that town square 3 years earlier had never really been her father's shame to bear. It had belonged, all along, to whoever slipped into that display and turned one small brass valve the wrong way. The next part of the story reached back 3 years to the day Dean Mercer became the joke of Red Mesa. He had wheeled a small demonstration model into the town square that spring, built from a large water barrel, an angled wooden trough, a small paddle wheel, a single piston, 2 brass valves, connecting pipe, and a wooden tank raised higher than a standing man. Dean claimed to the gathered crowd that falling water could pump a portion of itself back up into that tank without any outside power at all. Naomi had already watched the model work perfectly in their own yard days earlier, water rising steadily with no coal, no horse, and no hand turning a crank. But on the morning of the fair, Grant Holloway called Dean away to the council table just before the demonstration was set to begin. And in the few minutes he was gone, one of Warren's foremen slipped into the display area. He reversed the right-hand valve, cut the chain nearly through, packed gravel into the piston housing, and jammed the filter door shut. When Dean returned and opened the trough, the paddle wheel jerked violently. Red mud sprayed across the nearest spectators. The weakened chain snapped. The soft gear bent exactly as it was designed to do, and no water ever reached the tank at all. Dean went down hard in the dirt, while laughter rolled through the crowd around him. Warren stepped forward and asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, whether Dean had just invented a new way to turn clean water into mud. Naomi walked away before her father could even explain himself, too humiliated to stay and listen. In the present, Brooke Harlan turned up an old fairground logbook that recorded a Kincaid hand entering the display area shortly before the failed demonstration. A note Grant had personally struck through afterward. Cole examined the recovered valve and proved its threading had been carefully filed, so it could be reinstalled backward while still appearing untouched to anyone who did not look closely. Dean had not failed because his calculations were wrong. He had been sabotaged, and he knew it, though he could never catch the man responsible and could never find a single witness willing to speak. Naomi had already left town by the time he might have tried to explain, and afterward he simply stopped demonstrating anything at all, choosing instead to bury the completed version of his invention where no one could reach it, and where nothing could be reversed or filed down or packed with gravel ever again. What the whole town had laughed at that day was never the true Mercer Rainwheel. It was only a small model, and someone had broken it on purpose. Determined to prove her father was not entirely mad, Naomi resolved to repair the drivetrain and stage one modest test of her own. Cole rebuilt the pistons, replaced the leather gaskets, mended the chain, restored the check valve, repaired the flywheel, and reset the wooden trough. Nolan quietly brought forward an iron axle Dean had once left in his keeping for safekeeping, proof, whether Nolan meant it or not, that he had helped build the machine long before he ever claimed otherwise. The group loaded 6 water barrels onto a wagon to simulate a flow of moving water, and a handful of curious ranchers gathered to watch, along with Warren Kincaid, who came without being invited. When Naomi opened the trough, the water wheel began to turn, the axle moved, the pistons began their alternating strokes. Water rose steadily inside the pipe, and for a few seconds the gathered crowd fell completely silent. Then the pistons choked, the wheel slowed, red mud began spilling from the pipe's open end, the chain slipped free of its gear, and the whole machine ground to a stop. Laughter returned exactly as it had 3 years before. One rancher remarked that Naomi was indeed her father's daughter through and through. Warren told her, not unkindly, that she had inherited his stubbornness rather than any real genius. Furious at herself for trusting a strip of old canvas, Naomi nearly decided right there to sell the land and end the whole business for good. It was Cole who saved a bucket of the spilled mud and sifted through it afterward, finding twigs, gravel, scraps of leather, and coarse sand mixed through the water. The machine had never been broken at all. It was simply missing a filtering stage meant to strain debris before the water ever reached the pistons. Studying the map again with fresh eyes, Naomi finally understood that the 7 circles did not just mark 7 parts scattered across the wash, they marked 7 separate stations each holding a distinct piece of the whole system. There was an intake gate to guide water in, a settling pit to slow its force, a filtering drum to strain debris, a paddle wheel to capture the current, a piston assembly to lift the water, a stone reservoir to hold it, and finally a distribution gate to send it where it was needed. So far, buried beneath the desert, they had only found the piston assembly. Naomi had not yet unearthed her father's whole invention. She had only found one small piece of its beating heart. That evening, sitting beside the fire with Cole, Naomi finally allowed herself to say aloud what she had been carrying since the funeral. She admitted that part of her had wanted the machine to fail again, because a second failure would have made it easier to sell the land, take whatever money Warren offered, and go back to Prescott without ever having to forgive her father for choosing iron and copper over a daughter who needed him closer. Cole did not try to talk her out of the feeling. He only reminded her that her father had spent 15 years building, something meant to outlast every insult thrown at it, and that giving up now would only prove the town's cruelest joke correct. Naomi looked out at the dark shape of Black Ridge and decided quietly that she was done running from a laughter that had never once been earned. Brooke uncovered a signed agreement between Warren Kincaid and a representative of the railroad survey team, a document that explained a great deal about why Warren wanted the Mercer land so badly. Under its terms, Warren would supply water for the steam locomotives. Kincaid Spring would become the official watering stop. He would be granted rights to build a stage station, and holding pens, the surrounding Kincaid land would rise sharply in value, and any rancher hoping to ship cattle would be forced to pass through his property to do it. The agreement, however, only held if Warren could prove he controlled the only dependable water source for miles around, and a working Mercer Rainwheel threatened to undo that claim completely. If the machine succeeded, Red Mesa would have its own reliable water. The railroad could build its stop directly in town instead of on Kincaid land. Small ranchers would no longer depend on Kincaid Spring at all. Warren would lose his leverage over every mortgage he held, and the price he charged for water would become meaningless overnight. Nolan finally told the truth. He had seen Warren's foreman sabotage the fair model with his own eyes, and he had stayed silent all these years because Warren held the note on his ranch, and speaking up would have cost him his house, his horses, his wagon, and the land his late wife had once loved. Dean had never once pressured him to testify. All he had ever said to Nolan was that someday the wheel would speak for him, whether anyone else did or not. Nolan admitted, at last, everything Dean had sacrificed to build his invention, selling off his cattle to buy iron and pipe, trading his wagon for 2 pistons, taking mine work simply to scavenge discarded gears, mortgaging his own house to build the stone reservoir, refusing a doctor's care so he could keep paying the taxes on the land, and spending his final night alive marking that map for Naomi to find. Warren approached Naomi privately not long after and offered $25,000 for everything connected to the invention: the land itself, the map, the toolbox, the bent gear, and every part they had already unearthed. It was more money than Naomi had ever imagined holding at once, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life without ever thinking about Red Mesa again. She asked him plainly why a pile of scrap iron the whole town had mocked was worth so much to him. Warren told her he only wanted to spare her the same humiliation her father had already suffered. But in the middle of his explanation, he made one mistake, mentioning the seventh part of the system, the distribution gate, by name. Naomi had never spoken those words to anyone outside of Cole. Warren Kincaid did not merely know the Rainwheel existed. He had been hunting for its final piece for years. Grant announced that the land would go to auction in 10 days over the unpaid taxes, and from that point forward, Warren pressed Naomi from every direction he could find. The bank refused to extend her any credit. The general store would not sell tools on account. The local foundry declined to cast new gears for her. The town paper began referring to her, with a sneer, as the woman digging in the sand. Warren's men watched the ranch through the night, and eventually the harassment turned to open sabotage. Cole's tool wagon was burned to the frame, a fresh length of chain went missing, his forging table was smashed, Naomi's horse was let loose from its stall, and a knife was driven into her door beside a note demanding she leave Red Mesa for good. Sheriff Wade Braddock called the fire an accident caused by a knocked-over lamp, and though Naomi could see oil stains circling the wheel hub with her own eyes, she had no way to force him to investigate further. With the tool wagon gone, the group turned instead to an old steam tractor Dean had once bought from the mine, and Nolan restored its boiler valve, its pistons, its drive chain, its iron wheels, its cable winch, and its firebox until it ran again. The tractor was never meant to be the invention itself, only a way to move sand and stone quickly enough to keep digging before the auction date arrived. One by one they uncovered the remaining pieces. The intake gate turned out to be 2 curved stone walls set into the base of Black Ridge. The settling pit was a deep stone basin designed to spin and slow the incoming water. The filtering drum was an iron cage lined with steel teeth meant to push branches and debris aside. The paddle wheel was a wide wooden wheel rimmed in iron, resting flat beneath the creek bed. The stone reservoir sat higher on the hillside, disguised so well it looked like nothing more than a natural outcrop of rock. Only the seventh part, the distribution gate, still refused to reveal itself. Warren brought in horse teams, iron grading blades, and his restored steam tractor to tear apart the survey stakes marking their progress. And by the following morning the entire creek bed had been scraped flat and featureless. For one sinking moment, Naomi believed the map had become useless. Then, searching further through her father's toolbox, she found a small half-moon of iron, with 3 sighting holes drilled through it, a simple instrument meant to be aimed at 3 fixed points at once, the 3 highest peaks of Black Ridge, the exact place the sun set on the horizon, and the bell tower standing above Red Mesa. Lined up properly, the red cross on the map pointed to an entirely different dune, nearly half a mile from the ground Warren had already destroyed. Warren could level the creek bed and pull up every stake he liked. He could not move a mountain, and he could not move the sun. Naomi, Cole, and Nolan dug straight through the night, using the steam tractor's winch to haul bucket after bucket of sand up out of the growing pit. Near dawn, a wooden lid banded in iron finally broke free of the earth, held shut by exactly 7 bolts. Beneath it lay the central drivetrain chamber itself, containing a main shaft, 7 separate control levers, a large distribution gear, sections of chain, stone counterweights, pipes branching off in every direction, an iron control wheel, and symbols scratched into the wood that matched the ones drawn on the canvas map. The 7th part, the distribution gate, could send water to the town reservoir, fill the cattle troughs, feed the deeper seep holes, flush mud clear of the pistons, redirect a flood away from the houses below, seal the entire machine off for repairs, or release built-up pressure whenever the current ran too strong. Inside the chamber, Naomi found her father's old work coat, a tin lunch pail, a wrench forged to fit the main shaft perfectly, a logbook filled with pressure readings, and an unfinished letter addressed to her. Dean had written that he knew she was ashamed of him and that he held nothing against her for it. He only hoped that someday she would see the whole of what he had built, instead of remembering only the moment it once failed in front of a laughing crowd. While Naomi read, Cole ran his hands along the main shaft and discovered it had been cut nearly halfway through. If the full force of a flood struck the machine before that damage was repaired, the shaft would snap outright, the control wheel would jam solid, the water would surge straight toward Red Mesa uncontrolled, and the Rainwheel itself would be blamed for the very disaster it was built to prevent. Carved into a wooden beam above the shaft, Dean had left one final instruction, telling whoever read it not to stop the flood, but to give it honest work instead. From somewhere above them came the sound of wagons and horses, and Warren's men began pouring sand down into the entrance of the chamber. Naomi had finally found the whole of her father's invention, and now she faced the very real chance of being buried alongside it. She, Cole, and Nolan escaped through a narrow ventilation shaft, losing several tools, and her father's logbook in the chamber behind them as the sand closed in. The auction arrived regardless. Naomi asked to speak to the assembled townspeople before the bidding began, and she laid out everything she had gathered: the map, the reversed valve, the deliberately soft gear, the fairground logbook entry, Warren's railroad contract, the cut main shaft, and every part of the machine they had unearthed piece by piece. Warren answered every point in turn, reminding the crowd that the Rainwheel had never once run properly from start to finish, that both public tests had ended in spraying mud, that Dean had held no legal claim over the creek bed to begin with, and that a machine built to wait for rain could never provide water through a long desert year. Nolan stepped forward to testify, but the moment Warren mentioned his outstanding debt aloud, his nerve failed him, and he stopped short of telling the full truth. Grant declared that the memory of an indebted man carried no weight and refused to delay the sale on those grounds alone. Warren then challenged Naomi directly to run a working model right there on the main street of town, and she accepted without hesitation. This new model carried a properly seated valve, a working filter drum, functioning pistons, the correct soft gear, and a raised holding tank, and when water was poured down through the trough, the paddle wheel spun cleanly. The pistons struck their rhythm without hesitation. Water climbed steadily through the pipe, and the tank began to fill in full view of the crowd, all without a single ounce of coal or a single horse in harness. Nobody laughed this time. Warren simply pointed out, coolly, that a bucket of water and a raging flood were two entirely different tests. Grant allowed the auction to proceed regardless, and no one in town dared bid against Warren Kincaid's money. He claimed the land at a bargain price, with ownership set to transfer at sunrise the following morning. By evening, heavy clouds had gathered low and dark over Black Ridge, and Nolan looked up at them and said plainly that this storm would be bigger than anything the territory had seen in years. Mercy Wash was about to flood. Naomi had only one night left to prove the Rainwheel could work before Warren tore it apart for scrap. She walked home from the auction in silence, past neighbors who would not meet her eyes, and past the general store where the owner had refused to sell her so much as a length of rope. For the first time since the funeral, she let herself think about what her father must have felt walking these same streets after the fair, carrying the weight of a failure he knew was not his own, with no one willing to stand beside him and say so. She understood now why he had chosen silence over explanation, why he had buried the finished machine instead of fighting to be believed, and why he had waited, patiently and without complaint, for a daughter he trusted to finish what he could not. Naomi resolved that whatever happened at Mercy Wash that night, she would not bury the truth the way her father once had to. Rain began falling hard over Black Ridge, and within the hour water was already pouring down into Mercy Wash. Warren ordered his men to throw up a rough earthen dam meant to protect Kincaid Spring and his own cattle herd, and the dam forced the rising flood to swing instead toward the town stable, its feed store, its boarding house, its stage depot, and the lower-lying homes nearby, Naomi, Cole, and Nolan climbed back down into the machine chamber through the same narrow shaft they had escaped through earlier, only to find the Rainwheel still silent. That the filter drum was locked tight. One control lever had gone missing entirely. Sand clogged both pistons. The main shaft remained cut nearly through, and the water pressure outside was rising far faster than any of them had expected. Staring at the 7 circles marked on the map one more time, Naomi finally understood that they were not just 7 stations after all. They were also a required order of operations, a precise sequence for bringing the whole machine safely to life. She worked through the sequence exactly as the map instructed, opening the northern intake first, closing the southern trough second, freeing the locked filter drum third, locking the paddle wheel firmly onto the main shaft fourth, opening both pistons fifth, guiding the rising water up toward the stone reservoir sixth, and finally opening the distribution gate toward Red Mesa seventh. Piece by piece, the Mercer Rainwheel came alive around them. The iron drum began to turn, debris pushed cleanly aside. The wooden paddle wheel started spinning. The main shaft trembled under new pressure. Both pistons struck their alternating rhythm. Water surged through the pipes, and the stone reservoir slowly began to fill. Warren burst into the chamber in the middle of it, ordering Naomi to shut the machine down at once, insisting the diverted water was already pulling away from Kincaid Spring and rushing straight toward town instead. In his fury, he admitted outright that he had sabotaged Dean's original model years ago, simply because Dean had refused to sell him the design. Warren lunged for the central control lever, and Cole grabbed hold of him, before he could reach it. The damaged shaft began to crack under the strain of the fight. Naomi took the bent gear her father had left behind and fitted it into the auxiliary drive slot, exactly as the map had shown her. The gear bent further still, absorbing the sudden shock and holding the main shaft together long enough to survive the surge. The very thing the whole town had once laughed Dean out of town for had just saved his machine. For a moment, Naomi simply stood there, watching the bent gear hold under a strain it was never meant to survive, and she understood at last what her father had known all along, that the softest part of a machine is sometimes the only part strong enough to keep everything else from breaking. Cole shouted over the noise of the rushing water that the reservoir was holding steady, and Nolan, soaked through and grey with exhaustion, laughed for the first time in longer than he could remember. Warren sagged against the chamber wall, no longer fighting, his confession still hanging in the air between them. Naomi did not waste a moment gloating over him. She turned back to the controls because the flood was still rising, and Red Mesa still needed every drop of water this machine could carry away from its doorsteps. With the sequence complete, the Rainwheel ran at full strength, pulling water away from the flooded houses, lifting it steadily into the stone reservoir, feeding the town well, slowing the raging current, enough to spare the stable from being swept away, and tearing straight through the illegal earthen dam Warren's men had built only hours earlier. Sheriff Wade Braddock arrived in time to watch. With his own eyes, Warren still trying to force the control lever shut, even as the flood threatened the entire town around them. He pulled Warren bodily away from the machine. As the rain finally eased, water drawn up from the stone reservoir began flowing at last into the public well that had sat nearly dry for months on end. The machine the town had once called nothing more than scrap iron, waiting for rain had saved Red Mesa on the very night Warren Kincaid meant to bury it for good. In the days following the flood, the evidence against Warren gathered quickly and left little room for doubt. There was the reversed valve from the fairground model, the old logbook entry, Nolan's full and finally unburdened testimony, the deliberately cut main shaft, the burned tool wagon, the illegal dam that had redirected the flood straight toward Red Mesa, Warren's own confession inside the machine chamber, and Sheriff Wade's direct witness to all of it. A territorial judge, traveling with the railroad survey team, arrived in Red Mesa not long after and ordered Warren held for questioning, the sabotage formally investigated, the land transfer halted, the tax records reopened, and Grant Holloway's authority revoked entirely. Grant was removed from his position without ceremony. The auction itself was voided on the grounds that Warren had concealed the land's true value, damaged property to devalue it further, threatened landowners, manipulated the bidding process, and knowingly put the entire town at risk to protect his own interests. The railroad, in the end, chose not to sign an exclusive water agreement with Warren Kincaid at all. Instead, they agreed to build their stop near Red Mesa itself, on the condition that the town supply water through the Rainwheel system Dean had designed. Naomi refused to sell the machine to anyone. Instead, she posted a simple wooden sign near the town well that read, "Water belongs to those who keep the wheel turning." Any rancher who wanted a share of that water was asked to contribute 1 day of labor each month, lumber for repairs, leather for gaskets, iron for the shaft, or a willing hand to watch the machine whenever storm clouds gathered. Nolan stood before the town and openly apologized for the years he had spent staying silent. Cole hung the reversed valve on the wall of his forge, a plain reminder of how badly Dean had once been betrayed. Naomi never asked anyone to call her father a genius. She only told them, simply, that laughter had never once proven a man wrong. 6 months later, Red Mesa remained, at heart a desert town, and the Mercer Rainwheel had never promised endless green pasture or an end to hardship. What it offered instead was the chance to hold on to water that had always simply washed away and vanished into the sand. Small changes appeared gradually across the surrounding land. The town well no longer ran completely dry. Cattle had water even through the hottest weeks of summer. Small ranchers no longer had to pay inflated prices just to survive. The stone seep holes held rainwater long after a storm had passed. The stage depot reopened for business. Families no longer felt forced to sell their land and leave, and the railroad began construction on its new stop close to town, exactly as promised. Naomi and Cole reopened Dean's old blacksmith shop together, and there they began building smaller versions of the Rainwheel for ranches scattered along the seasonal washes throughout the territory. Each new machine was still built from the same humble materials Dean had always relied on: salvaged wagon wheels, iron chain, well pistons, brass valves, leather gaskets, and local timber. On every finished machine, they fixed a small brass plate that read Dean Mercer's Rainwheel, Red Mesa, Arizona Territory. Naomi kept the bent gear on her own workbench, and she never once tried to straighten it out. The very curve everyone had once called a flaw was the same curve that had saved the entire machine when it mattered most. On the anniversary of her father's death, she returned once more to the drivetrain chamber beneath Mercy Wash, and behind one wooden panel she finally found the last words he had left for her. They read simply that Naomi would come to understand why the wheel had to wait for the storm. She understood then that he had not only been speaking about the invention, he had been speaking about her the whole time. She sat down on the stone ledge beside the drivetrain and let herself remember him not as the man mocked in the town square, but as the man who had spent 15 patient years listening to iron and water until he understood a language no one else in Red Mesa had ever bothered to learn. She thought of all the seasons he must have walked out here alone, checking pressure gauges by lantern light, waiting for a storm that would either prove him right or bury him for good. She no longer felt the old shame that had once sent her running from this town. What she felt instead was something closer to pride, the kind that comes too late to be spoken aloud to the person who earned it, but not too late to be lived out in his name. Dean Mercer left behind no gold, no cattle, and no railroad shares. What he left instead was an invention nobody had trusted, a map that pointed down into the sand, a gear everyone believed was ruined, and a quiet faith that his daughter would not run from being laughed at a second time. The final scene comes at sunset, as a light rain moves quietly across Black Ridge. Beneath Mercy Wash, the paddle wheel begins turning once more, and the two pistons strike their steady, alternating rhythm like an iron heartbeat beneath the desert floor. Above ground, water flows gently into the cattle troughs, the way it was always meant to. This time, in Red Mesa, nobody is laughing.